Full screen mode. Okay, so today, vector versus raster graphics. We're going to primarily talk about what the differences are between Illustrator and Photoshop. Okay, I've probably mentioned a few of those differences in the past. Okay, we've talked briefly about vector and raster graphics. Okay, but let's dive into a little bit deeper and why we would use Illustrator versus Photoshop. Okay, and talk about the differences between vector and raster graphics. Okay, I imagine maybe half of us probably know what the difference is between what those two are, but let's first talk about raster graphics. Raster graphics, those of which we are working on in Photoshop, okay, are made up of individual pixels, or the entire image is made up of overall, the overall image is made up of individual pixels, okay? We've probably zoomed into a Photoshop file. I think I did it in the very beginning of the semester, where we zoomed into an image, and eventually, just like you see on the screen, you see exactly what you see here. It is composed of a bunch of tiny little colorful dots, okay? So these are raster graphics. Individual pixels make up an overall image. So this is primarily what we work on with inside Photoshop. Photoshop is a fantastic tool for editing raster graphics because of its ability to manipulate color and, or actually the ability to really manipulate color, okay? So, and the nice thing about that is that you are actually able to, in Photoshop, if you try really, really hard, I wouldn't recommend it because you'll be doing it for 10 years, you could actually edit every single pixel inside that image. So the beauty of that is that you have much, raster versus vector graphics. When you're working on a raster graphic, the beauty of it is that you can have very subtle changes in color, which is why you use raster graphics for things like imagery and photography and whatnot, okay? Because you have the ability to have beautiful blends and variations of color and very complex bits of color, whereas vector graphics is very much the opposite. We'll talk about that in a second. So what are some of the advantages of raster graphics? Pixel by pixel color allows for more flexibility and accurate final image color. So if you look at this example over here on the right, you can see this photograph of this model here. You can see that you can see all the tiny little pigments in her skin, all of the shadows, all of the colors in her hair, etc. and etc. Okay, so you have that ability to have those excessively fine details in a photograph. Okay, they are easier to edit where complex color is important. Photographs. Okay, so I'm going to be a little repetitive today, but you'll be an expert on the differences between the two. Okay, it is also easier to apply fancy effects to the images. So all of our tools that we've learned so far in Photoshop, those tools wouldn't even be possible if it wasn't for a raster image. Okay, you wouldn't have that ability to be able to make those different types of adjustments. Okay. Disadvantages. When zooming in, images become blurry and choppy. Okay, so you guys have probably done that, and an example of it is just like this. Another example of it is for those of you who I know a few of you have done this because you've asked me for my help. You've brought an image into InDesign and you've scaled it to fit your frame, and then when you plotted it, it was blurry. Well, this is an example of an image that was saved as a JPEG at a certain size, and you tried to blow it up too large and it became blurry. Okay, so when you export or save a raster image, it is strictly at the file size that it was saved at. It does not do well with getting smaller or larger. Okay, it is a lot easier to get smaller than it is to get larger. Okay, but it has trouble between the two. The second disadvantage is that file sizes can get extremely large. How many people here saved a image in Photoshop and it was 300 megs or 500 megs? I've had some that got up to a gig. Okay, that's part of the disadvantages of raster images, is that every time you make a change to them, they get bigger and bigger and bigger. You have a background image and you place in 5 people into your scene. Well, your final image is now the size of the original plus all of the 5. If you scaled if you scaled each of those people to be twice as big to fill the scene, well, all those 5 images are now twice as big as the original size. Okay, you can kind of see where this is headed. where it's extremely easy for the file size to get excessively large, making it really hard to send to people, okay? We all know about what our file limits are if you are trying to email someone an image, okay? So if you have Outlook, it's like 15, 20 megs. Google can probably do about the same. A lot of other people, though, can only send up to like 5 or 10 megs, okay? So just depending on what email program you have. Otherwise, you're very limited if it gets any bigger than that. You're setting up a link, you're putting it in Dropbox, and it becomes a big old process, okay? So raster images also take more computer memory or power to work with. You may have also noticed when working in Photoshop that when you started to have too much imagery in your file, started to slow down your computer a little bit. So that's part of the disadvantage. It takes a much more powerful computer to run the software and to deal with images like that, okay? So there are big advantages and big disadvantages for really both graphics, okay? So for photography, for printing, raster graphics are fantastic. For photo editing, raster images are fantastic, okay? A lot of times you can avoid large file sizes by simple file management and making sure that when you take the original photograph that it's not, 50 megs already. You don't need to always take photographs at 50 megs. The quality of the camera, regardless of the megapixel size, will always be the same, whether or not you're taking 5 megapixels or you're taking 20, okay? It's just not gonna be able to get as large, all right? So next, we have vector graphics. Vector graphics are created through mathematical definitions of shapes, lines, and curves, okay? So unlike raster graphics, where every individual pixel is a particular color, vector graphics are defined through mathematical algorithms, if you will, okay? So for example, you have a rectangle in Illustrator or in InDesign. Well, that rectangle has 4 points that represent the 4 corners of the rectangle, and it's filled in with a particular color. That is an example of a vector graphic. That's all the software needs to know, is where basically the outlines of that shape are and what is the color of that shape. That is all it is. Okay, it's as simple as that, broken down into a nutshell. The difference is that you certainly can have complex vector graphics, but you just might have a multitude of various shapes and sizes and colors, okay? So for example, as I just said, a square, for example, is made up of 4 control points, and a computer plays connect the dots to create lines and fill it in, okay? So that's kind of vector graphics in a nutshell. You can see here in this little blow up, going down to this logo here, which we will actually, next class, we'll have an entire lecture on logos, okay? So we'll talk about that more later. But you can see here that you have a very rigid line on all of the edges of that logo, and it's filled with a particular color, okay? So what are some of the advantages of vector graphics, okay? The first and most important one, in my opinion, is that they are scalable. You can make them as small or as large as you want to. There is no limit to how small or large these type of graphics are, okay? So whether or not you want to put them on a business card, okay? So maybe your logo is going to be the size of a quarter, or you want to put your logo on a billboard that you're going to see off of 680, okay? Actually, there's not really too many billboards on 680, when I think about it. 24, maybe in Oakland. All right, so whether it be a business card or on a billboard. Okay, so the nice thing about vector graphics is you make them small or as large as you want to. And the benefit of that is even when you do make them excessively large, it does not change the file size, okay? So all you're doing is simply you're using an algorithm to make those shapes just smaller or larger, okay? So file sizes are always very small. So the nice thing about an Illustrator file, unless you are incorporating raster graphics inside of Illustrator, your graphics will always, or your file size will always be very small. So the nice thing about actually InDesign and Illustrator is that even though both are vector-based programs, they're both capable of housing both raster and vector images, okay? So InDesign, for example, you can create line work and you can create shapes that are all vector-based images, or vector, or just vector shapes, whereas you can fill them in with a raster image. So as long as the image is the correct size and it is preferably the size of the image or smaller that you bring it in at, both programs will work very well. So both programs work well with using both vector and raster images. Okay, so but unlike Photoshop, if you start to include a bunch of raster images inside of Illustrator and InDesign, your files will get bigger. Okay, so, but it's usually those images that make the larger file size. Vector graphics are also much easier on your computer to manipulate. Okay, so it's not going to take big old graphics cards or large amounts of memory to work on vector graphics. So a lot of graphic designers prefer to work with vector images because of their ability to make lots and lots and lots and lots of graphics without necessarily filling up their hard drive in like a year. Okay, so they prefer to work with vector graphics whenever they can, at least as much as possible. Of course, we all know that's not always possible. Okay, so those are some of the advantages of vector graphics: scalable images, small file sizes, and easier to use for your computer. Okay, so what are some of the disadvantages? So the most important and the largest disadvantages of vector graphics is the opposite of what the advantage is of raster graphics. Okay, is that it is really hard to have very complex photographs as a vector image. Okay, so when I say that, I don't necessarily mean bringing in a raster image into a vector file. That's no problem. It's not gonna make any difference. But I'll actually show you today how to turn a raster graphic into a vector graphic using Illustrator. Okay, so it is a very powerful tool to do that. But you can see here with the example on the left, is a raster graphic. Okay, so that's just a standard photograph. Well, you can easily see all of the finer details of the girl's face. You can see the shadows, you can see the complexities in her skin, you can see the variations in color on her skin really easily. Well, whereas the graphic over here on the right is a lot different. Okay, this is actually the same exact photograph turned into a vector image. Okay, what the program does is it defines shapes on the girl's face and it starts to associate them with blocks of color. Okay, you can see here that you have much less depth and variation in the skin color. Okay, it still looks pretty good, and from a distance you probably wouldn't notice a lot of those big differences, but that is the major difference. Okay, if what you're focusing on is quality imagery or quality photographs, you're going to want to make sure that you use a raster based program to make those edits. Okay, if you're not as focused on those kind of things, a vector program like Illustrator or InDesign will work just fine. Okay, so when to use raster versus vector graphics. Raster graphics, photographs, high dynamic range images. Okay, those are going to be the most common uses for raster graphics, whereas vector graphics, things like line drawings, logos, and fonts are going to be your preferred file types for vector images. So what do we all think the reason why? Actually, let's back up a little bit. So if we had to guess program like AutoCAD, which makes line drawings, what would we guess what kind of program is that? Vector graphics. Okay, right, exactly. You're creating line work. Why would we think that AutoCAD produces files with vector graphics? What would be the advantage of having a architectural drawing that is a vector image? Exactly. You can blow it up, you can make it smaller, you can do whatever you want with it without affecting the quality and the clarity of the line work. Okay? When you're dealing with architectural graphics, it's very important to have crisp, precise line work, be able to have text, line work, etc., that you can easily read. Okay? Whereas if you plot an architectural drawing, and let's say it's a PDF is a scalable drawing. If I want to print it out half size, so maybe it's 24 by 36, I decide to make it 12 by 18. That's half size. I want to print it out half a size. It's not going to reduce the quality of that file. Okay. If I want to blow it up to twice, maybe it's an architectural detail or it's something that's this big on the sheet, and I want to print it up full twice the size on an 8.5 by 11 paper. No problem. It's not going to have any problems doing that. Whereas a lot of raster graphics typically would. Where he talked about why logos work well. Okay. Type fonts.
CAD files don't have color variation.
I'm sorry?
CAD files don't have the color variation.
Sure, exactly. Correct, they don't. There typically is no color. Although I will tell you that if you're plotting something like a colored elevation, there would be color inside it. But it could still be a vector graphic. It's still composed of blocks of color and line work. Okay. But for example, in Revit, if you plot your files with shadows, where you start to have the gradients in color, that file is automatically turned to a vector graphic that can't be scalable. Okay, not really relevant to this class, but just kind of a little fact there. Yes.
Is this why when you apply textures into AutoCAD, it looks so cruddy?
What kind of, like a?
Just you apply it like you would in like 3ds. You just take a JPEG and apply it.
Yes, I mean you can bring in JPEGs into AutoCAD. You can bring JPEGs into Revit. That's no problem. But yes, it's still a vector. It's still a vector file. I'm sorry, it's still a raster file ultimately. Okay, so both programs, just like Illustrator and InDesign, are capable of housing either file types without any problems. But they each have their advantages and disadvantages. Lastly, advantage of a vector file. Type and fonts, they can get as small, as large as you want them to be, whether or not it be type 12 font or point 12 font that you're writing a piece, an English paper on, or you want to make those words, 600 font. The quality of the letter work is not going to change. Okay, rule of thumb: try not to do typography inside Photoshop. For that reason, when you add typography inside Photoshop, you are adding a raster image of the font. Okay, so if you place it on your screen and you're done with it and you say, "Yep, I'm done," you are not going to be able to. If you scale it to make it smaller or larger, all you're doing is just scaling the raster image. So the only advantage, or the only way you can really make that work in Photoshop, is if you say, "I want it 18 font," and you make it 18 font and you leave it 18 font, and you don't make it smaller or larger. But if you export it as a JPEG and you zoom in on it, it is going to get pixelated. You're not going to get those real crisp lines like you would in Illustrator. Yeah.
The font artists are like audio fonts. where there's perfection, imperfection. So the font artists typically like to stay in the raster world.
Font artists do?
At least from a book I read, yeah.
Oh, I've never heard that. But maybe if you have an article or something, maybe share it. I'm not sure I quite understand it, but I'll certainly look into it.
There's slight imperfections when it's hand drawn versus when it's in the raster form.
Mm-hmm.
The human recognizes that and it becomes an emotional reaction. It's different.
Well, it's kind of like, maybe I can kind of relate it to like architectural hand lettering, where there's kind of a beauty to that, to where it's actually, there's kind of the human touch.
Like in the audiophile world, there's people who like two components.
Oh, you're saying audiophile, like a music expert.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Versus solid state
Yeah.
components.
Yeah, I could see that.
People say two sort of sound better. What is that?
Yeah. Yeah, understandable. So I think this is our last, almost. So just a couple more slides talking about vector versus raster graphics. Here's a little kind of comparison to what happens when a certain image gets smaller and larger. Okay, so over here on the left-hand side, you can see that we have a resolution, very small resolution, 250 by 78. That's a very teeny tiny file. Okay, so that's just imagining this logo. Imagine this logo as a vector, and bitmap is just another word for raster, okay, or the raster image. Notice that when that logo is at this resolution, it's 36 kilobytes, okay? Well, regardless of the resolution, notice that the logo stays the same size, okay? The file size does not get bigger. But notice that as the logo for the raster image gets larger, it starts to not only double, it's actually like times 10, and then times, I guess then it goes by 4. But you can see how it exponentially gets larger when you make the resolution of that file just a little bit bigger. And even 1500 by 466 is still considerably a small file. It's not anything large by any means, okay? So this example over here on the left is an example of, it could be an Illustrator file or an InDesign file, where it's actually a combination of various different file types. So you have an EPS file, which is actually a file type that's used, it is a vector file type that is used for, I want to say it's for creating, I think like t-shirts. It's a file type that allows your vector file to be turned into a series of points, okay, just kind of like we were creating with the pen tool. All right. You also have a bitmap photo or a raster image in the center, where it's also a TIFF file. A TIFF file is another example of a raster image. And then lastly, you have your type file, or your type or your fonts at the very bottom that represents all of our vector. Yeah.
So I know that TIFFs are notorious for being giant files. Why are they so much bigger than like a JPEG?
I'm not 100% sure. I don't typically use them because of that reason, but I think they typically work well for people who do a lot of photography. So they have the ability to house more information. I think that's the case. We can continue to look at it a little bit further, but I believe that's why. JPEGs, although JPEGs are nice because their ability to show brilliant color, but they're also on how they compress the file. But when you do save it as a JPEG, you do lose certain aspects of that original photo. Whereas if you shoot in like RAW, a lot of the times you might have a TIFF file as a result of the RAW file. But when you save it as a JPEG, it does make it a lot smaller, and that's great, but you do lose certain aspects of it. But it's still, the industry standard for sending someone some type of a raster graphic, because most people aren't going to notice those differences anyways, but a photographer might. Okay, so here's that same illustration, whereas the example on the left, that is the vector logo. That is an example of something similar to what we will create next class on Monday when we talk about logos. When you zoom in at 1600% on the edge of that logo, notice that the line work is still excessively or extremely crisp, okay? So the quality of that logo does not change when you are using a vector program like Illustrator or InDesign. Whereas the image on the right is the same thing blown up inside Photoshop, okay? Obviously much different. You wouldn't want your logo, especially something that represents your brand of your company, to be a little blurry on a company letterhead or on a business card or something like that. So that's kind of an example of the two or kind of an example of a vector and a raster graphic of that logo. Okay, so computer programs, examples. What programs or what piece of software will you use for both raster and vector programs? For raster images, you all know Photoshop. We've been talking about it all day. We've talked about it all semester. GIMP, another photo processing software, and then also V-Ray or any rendering software, or most rendering software, I take that back, is going to produce a raster graphic. It is going to produce an image file. So your end result of that rendering is going to be a JPEG, a PNG, a TIFF file, etc. Okay. Whereas vector files, things like Illustrator and InDesign, are great because they are vector-based software, but they're also able to house, they are able to still incorporate raster images. Okay, we talked about AutoCAD being a vector-based program, being that all it does is create line work. Okay, we also have Vectorworks, Revit, and Rhino. Rhino is another example of a vector-based software. Okay, any questions about that? Anything at all, Brian?
I know 3ds is specifiable, but which one does it naturally fall under?
Max? I believe it's actually a raster program, but I take that back. I think it has the ability to plot in both as a PDF. It could be a vector file, but it depends what you're doing with it. So if you're using 3ds Max to create a rendering, it's going to produce a raster image. But I think it's kind of like Rhino, whereas the user interface is kind of a flatter user interface. So maybe when you're working, it might save as a PDF, whereas it might be a vector file. So it depends on what the outcome of what you're trying to do. But I think it's kind of like Revit, to where it could be both. Okay, questions? Anything else before we move on? All right, I'm going to go ahead and just keep going right into what we're going to be doing today. all right, so that we don't have to break up the recording into 2 bits. So what are we going to be doing today? So last class we started with the font exercise. Everyone here created the fonts. I noticed that a majority of us turned it in, which is fantastic. I do got to apologize. I made a little bit of a boo-boo. Unfortunately, you guys won't have to pay the penalty. I accidentally gave you guys the wrong template for that font program. So if you guys have turned it in, you are done. Okay, I'm not going to make you go to the next portion of the exercise. If you would like to actually create the font, I will show you how to do that by the end of the day. If you go to exercise 14 and you click on the font design template again, unfortunately I just accidentally gave you the template from last semester. I told you that the website actually went out of business. So we have a new website that we're going to be using, but they also have a new template. So if you have already turned it in, you are done. You have full credit. Okay. If you would like to take the extra effort in making the font, I'll throw you a few extra points on the assignment. So if you need extra credit, maybe take the extra half an hour and actually convert it to the new template. It's very easy. I'll show you how to do that here real quickly. I am going to use Angelina's assignment from last class as an example, since she did such a great job. So this is what she turned in right here. Okay. So all of the letters and symbols are all complete. Well, the one that you download now, this is going to be the same template, very similar. Okay, you're going to notice that, it's mostly the same, but the way that the calligrapher software actually reads the template file is just a little bit different. So I actually took all of the lowercase letters and brought them over here in probably about 5-10 minutes. Okay, it didn't take long to actually bring it over. I know we all have better things to do, so if you want to take the time to bring them over, it is extremely easy. So what you'll do, I'll just show you an example of how you would do that. So I'm going to bring over Y, X, or W, X, Y, and Z. Okay, there's actually 2 sheets to this. So right now, if I click on my layers, you'll notice that we have page 1 and page 2. Right now I have page 2 activated. So notice that I have all of the other layers currently turned off. If I want to turn on my guides, I can do that. The guides tell you the baseline, X height, cap height, and all of the other valuable information you need to add your fonts to it. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off though for now. And right now all I have activated or turned on is page 2, and I put all of my text on the font page 2 layer. Okay, so with my font page 2 layer, I can go over and I could copy my fonts from last week's exercise. So I just take that file. You guys all created this file. I'm going to go over to, I'm going to say Z, for example. I'm going to select all 4 of those. I'm going to do them all at the exact same time. So I selected them all. Okay, right now it's kind of a block, so I'm going to double click on the Z. I'm going to select all of those 4 letters. I'm going to copy it, bring it over to the new template. I'm going to paste it. They do come in pretty small. I'm going to make them much larger. Okay, I'm going to turn on my guides too. And I'm going to turn on my stroke palette. I'm going to make them a little bit bigger. I'm going to make them like size 3 or size 4. And then from here, since these are larger letters, I'm going to make sure that my baseline is right there. I'm just going to simply scale it. So because these are vector graphics, you can make them as small or as large as you want to by simply scaling them on your page. Okay, so even though it's not the most fun thing, it is kind of good practice on how the software works. Okay, so simply going like that. That's my capital letter, so that's 2 letters. Okay, if you get good at it, which you will, you can probably do multiple at the exact same time. Okay, so that's going to be my 3rd letter, and then I'll place my last one like so. Okay, so while I'm scaling it, I'm holding down Shift so that my proportions stay exactly the same as the previous exercise. Okay, and that's what page 1 of the new template would look like. Okay, so when you're ready to do the first page, you go back over to your layers. I'm going to turn off font page 2. I'm going to turn off the page 2 template, and I'm going to turn on the page 1 template. Okay, the page 1 template will give us the remainder of our capital letters and a couple of our symbols. And you'd go through that same process of simply just copying and pasting them onto the new template. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. I'm actually going to just finish up this last little page, and then maybe in about an hour or so, I'll take you through the process of how you upload it onto the Calligrapher website. It will then give you a font file to which I will show you how to load onto these computers. Okay, so if you're doing this at home, it's really easy. When you double click on that font file, it loads it onto your computer. It's super simple. But computers here at school are a little bit different. You can't download anything on them. So luckily there's a good piece of software which I will give to you today that allows you to temporarily add fonts to your computer so that you can use them. And I'll also show you I'll show you a good website to where you can find additional fonts. So for example, if you don't like any of the 400 fonts that are on Illustrator already, you can go on. There's plenty of great websites to go out there and find fonts. You can temporarily download them on the computer, use them for your portfolio, use them for your assignments, what have you. Okay, so I'll show you guys how to do that in about an hour or so. So this portion of the exercise is extra credit. You don't have to do it. So if you've already turned in the original exercise, great. You've already completed the practice. Technically, you've accomplished what I wanted you to accomplish in terms of practice with the pen tool. Okay, so more to come on this here in just a little bit. And if you have questions, feel free to ask me. So the end result's pretty cool to actually see a font that you created and do some typing with it. You know, it's kind of a rewarding experience. So if you want to do that, it'll probably take you about half an hour to convert this and go through the tutorial. Okay, and I'll give you extra credit for that particular assignment if you finish it. So moving on, the next part of it. So if you go to Canvas, you're going to go to part 2. So part 1 for assignment 15 is optional. Okay, so you don't have to do that now, as I just stated. So that's going to be part 1. Everything that I just said is going to be part 1. So if you go to part 2, this exercise is going to be called Mastering the Pen Tool. Okay, we are going to be tracing this stencil that I have given you. Okay, so if you click on Flower Stencil, you're going to get this nice. Of course, it doesn't have the ability to open up that file for whatever reason. Give me one sec. I'll just show it to you from here. Still not going to let me. I'm going to open up in. Let's open up in Paint. Okay, so this is what that file looks like. Okay, so your goal, using the tools that we talked about last class, should be to try to duplicate this as much as possible using the pen tool. Okay, so this becomes a little bit more complicated. Obviously, we have a lot more curves, we have a lot more variation in line work, but using the tools that we talked about, and I'll go over a couple of them here in just a second. I'll do maybe the first few little wisps. I will show you how to, some of the cool tools that you can use to get a nice end result. So what does that end result look like? Okay, so this was an example that I created last semester. Okay, so I incorporated several different line widths. Okay, so I used the width tool. I used the different profiles that we learned in the stroke category in Illustrator. I also worked with color, and I also applied some shadows so that my line work started to create some depth. So the nice thing about this graphic, when created in Illustrator, I can make it as small or as large as I want to. Okay, major extra credit if anybody gets this as a tattoo. Like 1,000,000 points. Automatic A quad plus. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do it. I don't think I'm actually legally allowed to tell you to do that. Yeah, maybe like a big what if I did it? Like on my tricep or something. I'd be the coolest teacher in the world. No, okay, I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't recommend anybody doing it. But you can start to see that, you know, with a little creativity, you can make this look really nice. And depending on how you kind of approach it, you can have a million different incomes. So how might you do that? Let's go ahead and open up Illustrator. I'm just going to actually open up a new instance of Illustrator. It's already telling me you already have it open. So I'm going to go to File, New, and I'm going to go ahead and just use a letter. That's fine. Just everything how it is right now is good. I'm gonna go ahead and call this flower. Let's call this, whoops. I'm gonna call this flower stencil. Okay, I'm gonna hit OK. And then from there, I'm gonna go to File, Place. Okay, File, Place. And actually, before I do that, let's do a couple things. I'm going to create a new layer. The first layer I am going to rename as Graphic. Okay, and then layer 2 I'm going to name as Line Work. If you want to have multiple, if you want the ability to create multiple layers, you might consider creating more layers so that you can kind of push and pull them and maneuver them how you wish. But I'm going to call that second, layer Line Work. Okay, and then from here I'm going to click on my graphic layer. I'm going to go to File, Place, and I'm going to place that flower stencil onto my sheet like so. Okay, so when I place this image on here, this is an example of what kind of graphic. I just pulled it in. It's a JPEG. What kind of image is this? Yeah, it's a raster image. This is actually, I can make this much larger if I want to. I can make it as large as Illustrator will let me, but it will eventually get blurry. Okay. Luckily, so if you actually zoom in on it, you can see here how ugly that gets. That's a perfect example of what we saw in the lecture. Okay, so we're gonna attempt to duplicate this, but on our own. Okay, so from here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over to Line Work, and I'm gonna start to trace the different elements that we might have here on my screen. So I'm gonna go to my pen tool right here, and like we learned last class, I'm gonna start to trace these different forms. Okay, so I'm gonna do maybe about 2 or 3 of these. Okay, I'm gonna start right here on this end, and I'm gonna start to trace. Actually, before I move on, let me actually change my stroke to maybe like red or something that we could see really well. Okay, and now, I'm sorry? Yes, actually, good point. Great point. So I'm going to click on my fill as well. I'm going to make that no fill, and now we could start to. Now we can start to draw. Okay, so first point, I'm going to start to bend that around that shape. Remember, the fewer the points you have, the smoother the line will be. So if you start to do, this, it's not going to be very smooth. If you start to go every couple inches, it's not going to look the greatest. So I promise, try to do as little as possible, little points as possible, and start to wrap around the edges of this shape. Okay, remember that if you make a little boo-boo, don't be alarmed. You can go back and you can use your direct selection tool, start to manipulate some of those points, start to manipulate some of the different tangents of the arcs. Okay, so I'm going to end right there for my first line. The other thing to keep in mind as you're doing this is that if your line isn't perfectly on top of the example image, don't worry about it. Feel free to kind of make this your own a little bit. So for example, like right here where I see that line kind of jump off of that a little bit, not the biggest deal. I can use my direct selection tool to manipulate that, if it'll let me select it. Why are you not letting me select that? Okay, there we go. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and take some of these dots. I'm going to smooth this out just a little bit. Okay, and that's starting to look a little bit better. Okay, so that's going to be one line. So what might I do with that line? So a couple options to start to make it a little bit different from the rest. All right, I'm going to go back to my stroke tool. I'm going to click on these show more options. A couple things I might do, I might change the weight of it. So I might make it larger. I might make it smaller. Okay, remember we talked about profiles. So maybe it does something like that, to where the ends of it are to a sharp point and the middle of it is a little bit thicker. Okay, so depending on the profile that you use, you can start to get various different looks into all the different lines that you have on your sheet. So think about hierarchy. You know, when we talk about hierarchy between colors, shapes, kind of use that same philosophy when you're creating your line work for your stencil. Okay, so you might start to create a hierarchy of various different leaves so that it ultimately will help create a little bit of depth to the flower. Okay, if they're all the same size and they're all the same color, it's not going to look, you know, three-dimensional by any means. Okay, so think about those different things. You have profile, you have weight, you also have the ability to adjust the cap, the corner. Yeah, arrowheads not really important. We'll talk more about those a little bit later. You could also try messing with the gradient. Okay, I'm sorry, not the gradient, but the opacity. Okay, so if I go up here to if I click on my line, okay, I can go up here to opacity. I could make it lighter or darker if I have lots of overlapping lines, so you can start to get some gradation in that way too. You could use your width tool. All right, so we learned the width tool last class right here. Okay, so I could do something like that. Okay, so the world is really yours. You can do a lot of really cool things with the tools that we learned last class to create this nice graphic. The last thing that I'm going to show you before I let you guys loose is some of the effects, and you guys might go through and play with some of these effects. There's too many to even talk about, but the one that I used in my example right here was the shadow effect. And to do that, I'm going to select the line. Okay, I'm going to select the line, I'm going to go to effect, and let's see, let me just refresh myself. It's going to be under, I think it's under artistic, not stylize. Let's see, it's going to be under stylize, and I'm going to go over to, I think it's outer glow, drop shadow. Okay, and then from here you have the ability to kind of define what that shadow might look like. I would probably just start with the shadow that it gives you, okay, or I'm sorry, with the settings that it gives you. But you can control the color of the shadow. You can control how dark it is. You can also control how much shadow the line gives out. Okay, so try to manipulate with some of those. Try to experiment with some of those settings to see what results you get. So I'm going to click on preview so I can see what I get. But now if you notice that if I look at my image and I'm going to go to my layers, I'm going to turn off the original graphic, you'll actually see that I have a nice little drop shadow behind my line. So now it looks like that line is actually starting to kind of stand off the page a little bit. So you can see where once we move on past the pen tool, where this will become really handy if you want your image to kind of jump off the page a little bit. That's a nice little effect that will work pretty well. Okay, any questions before I let you guys get started? Good. All right, it's 7:23. Why don't you guys come back, take a break if you would like, come back at 7:35. It's about 10 minutes or so. And then we'll have the rest of the class to work on our exercise. All right, have fun. I'll leave this example up here on the screen so that you guys have something to reference.